been recorded, I guess we can start. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Shapira. I work today at the Israeli Institute of Rhetoric. Beyond that, I am DCA, one of the DCAs for the next World Championship, which is BP, which is going to be held in Chennai this December. I am the CA for the Vienna European Championship, which is going to be in 2015. Yeah, that's planning ahead a bit. And I've done quite a bit of adjudication, mostly in Europe and China, and of course in Israel. And that pretty much is my credentials in terms of what we're going to talk about when it comes to judging BP. Okay? So for start, even if you're not planning on a career in judging, which is perfectly fine, I can tell you that one of the things you probably heard from your coach is that there are no shortcuts in debate. You can become better only by a lot of hard work. That is true bar one thing, judging. Judging in BP is one of the quickest ways to become better and fast. One of the smartest things I've done in my personal debating career was to take my, it was my third semester of debating. I actually quit speaking for just one semester and went on into judging. And you will feel that difference, and people who hear you speak will feel that difference. So I definitely recommend, even if you're not considering, if you don't want to really, you're not really interested in the judging, you just want that action of being a debater, take a few rounds off and try to judge it. You will learn so much from it, and we'll get more to that. So what are we trying to do today, time permitting? First of all, I want to talk about what it is we're looking for when we're talking about judging in BP. We'll try to talk a bit about certain differences that it might have from other styles. Josh Martin is also here to contribute to that, to translate to American if you want. Then I'm going to talk about some methods that might help you reach better decisions. These are very subjective and sort of like things that work for some people and ways that can help you take down notes basically and use them in an effective way. And in the end, I want to talk a bit about how you can become a contributing panel member in a world's environment or generally a BP environment. This is important because, if you're going to judge a few tournaments, you want to do well. And doing well depends on how helpful you can be for your people, for the people you're working with. So, can anyone hear me, by the way? Is that good? So let's start. What are we looking for when it comes to BP? So in general, as in all debate, you're trying to look for that ever-elusive kind of thing called persuasiveness, which is a bit of a complicated term because many people find different things persuasive. In BP today, what we kind of focused on is an idea called holistic debating. Sounds very interesting. Holistic debating takes into account three things. It is engagement, content, and style. All these feed into one another, and we're going to go through them one by one and talk about how that feeding into one another works. Before we move on, though, I want to say something when it comes to judging, in BP especially, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same in policy or forensics or any other method. These things are a bit more fluid than they sound. They're fluid also because they are open to some interpretation, but beyond that, every year at Worlds we have an A team that basically gives out a Worlds briefing, the judges briefing, which include how will you judge debate in this tournament. It's almost identical to the year before, except minor changes. But that would make it very different from 10 years ago. So debating in itself, when it's judged, is kind of like this fluid thing where we build on top of what came before, and every time there's a bit of addition. Sometimes there are bigger leaps and smaller leaps, but just so you know that that's a thing. So if you become a World's DCA or a US National CA or something of that sort, you could find yourself affecting the ways we debate and affecting the way we judge to an extent that the things I say here today could be in 5 years almost wrong, which is fun and interesting to think of. So, what is engagement? Let's start with that. I say engagement. What do you guys hear? Pardon? Involvement. That's actually pretty good. Participation. Participation I wouldn't take. Participation has some sort of passive, almost passively do it in terms of other people in the room. Okay? Like, as long as you don't even need to stand up in order to participate in the debate. But yeah, when we look at engagement, what we try to do mostly is try to say, how do you operate in sort of like in reflection or in combination with what happened around you? Now, this obviously means the two teams to your opposite, we're talking VP, but it could also be said that this is also how do you react to your other half, okay? How did you react when, if you were first half and suddenly your second half came up with a brilliant idea? Are the POIs you gave afterwards, were they there to contribute to your engagement, to make you more relevant than they are? Or were your POIs things that basically didn't contribute that much to anything? Same thing about second half. If you had a very good first half and you ended up repeating what they said, it could be said that you engaged with the other side, right? Because they were very good and you engaged with them. But you didn't really engage with the other team in terms of trying to show why you are better than them, which is another form of engagement, okay? So obviously in this kind of game where we're talking about engagement being a very important thing, and sometimes the first thing people look at, POIs become very important, rebuttal becomes very important. Now, I want it from here. Does this mean, and this is the difference between some formats that I know that are practiced in the United States, that we need to engage everything they said? Why not? Why yes, why not? Who's that? Yes?
The ones that are shaping the debate, like if you can go and say, refute every single thing, you would have to.
But you wouldn't have a tick of basically refuting everything, right? We wouldn't be looking for that. We would be looking for, did they answer the things that really changed debate? What in some cases are called impact, not really used outside the United States, but exist. Let's take some examples, okay? I'm going to use basically some stuff I after watching Fox and Friends this morning, I put some things in there. This house, we're in government, we're in opposition to the outward, we're judging, okay? Let's look at some government arguments regarding why they don't like Obamacare, okay? Not really going to name the motion, but that's fine. So, number one, Obamacare would actually reduce employers' ability to hire. That's one argument, very title-ish, of course. Second, some people don't like it. Third, Obamacare hurts freedoms that are part of people's rights. Fourth, it has a silly name. 5, health is really important. Healthcare even more so. And 6, Obamacare was Stalin's ID. Okay, now we have the first government that basically gave us all these. What are the things inside that we would expect to hear answers for? Go.
The conversation about freedom.
The conversation about freedom, right? Because if Obamacare is indeed, I'm not talking about the validity of the argument right now, but obviously if this is something that impends on, that hurts people's rights, this is something that has what you would call maybe major impact. This really affects the decision making. This is in the heart of what we would call a clash, right? Good, what else? What would we not answer? Obviously, yeah, probably silly name we wouldn't answer. Now that's interesting. Why would we not answer that?
Holds no relevance.
Well, does it? If we're trying to say that, you know, in a world where branding is important, a silly name might be a problem there. It goes to a very specific part of BP. You're right, it doesn't really hold relevance, but it could be argued that it does.
It's a weak argument.
Before we talk about weak arguments has to go with argumentation theory. We will discuss that, but that's a very, like, the idea that we can say about an argument is weak has so much behind it, I don't want to jump into that pool yet.
It just doesn't matter.
Why not?
Because who cares if it has something or not?
Why does anyone care, though?
Whatever we call it doesn't impact like what Obamacare does. It doesn't change what's actually going to happen when we use it.
In other words, the government could easily solve this problem in how many sentences? Find a better name. And they would still. Why did I want to put an emphasis on this? Because in BP we have something that's called, we do less a lot less of what you do in other formats, which is called attacking the model or the plan or the mechanism. There's a reason behind it. There's a logic behind it. You may not agree with it, but I do want you to leave here knowing why we want to do that. And that reason is because we don't find things important if they can be fixed in a sentence. Okay? And that is why sometimes when people say about, let's say, whatever the mechanism is, we will, we will force everyone or every citizen to participate in, I don't know, 4th of July celebrations. Okay? Let's go local. Now, if someone came up with something like, yeah, but what about children who can't really decide if they go, will you punish them or not? It's very easy in one sentence to say, okay, we'll exempt children, right? Preferably, you would have done that in the government speech, but it wouldn't really change the heart of the debate. You solve it in one sentence and move on. And a lot of attacks on mechanism or plans or models are basically that. Small things that could be solved like that and don't really affect what we call the guts or the heart of the debate. And the silly name is a good example. Okay? Not because necessarily you can't make an argument that something that is branded badly could be received badly by the public and therefore not be successful, if indeed we could make that argument about, no, never mind Obamacare right now, I'm talking in general, but because it's so easy to solve, it leaves us without a debate. And that's something that's really, sometimes it's tough for people to understand, and it's really important to me to hold on that. Now, how about health is really important, or healthcare is really important? Why not?
Because it's overgeneralized and not speculative resolution or subject matter.
Very good. There's more to it. It's so generalized that what?
It's not mutually exclusive on either side. Both sides can agree to it.
Both sides can agree that healthcare is very important. Okay? Now, you would think right now when we're talking in sort of like lab environment that well, that's obvious. But how many of you have already been to a debate where a speaker started with, Mr. Speaker, healthcare, without healthcare, someone cannot live. They need to worry about their future. You know, give you that extensive language, the opposition can just come up and say, yeah, you're right. And move on. So that's probably not the strongest one out there. Okay? How about some people? Now, before we move on to some people don't like it, because I think that's a more interesting one. Let's say let's say I'm a debater right now, just as a tip for debating in VP. And I have a government which basically gave me those two arguments. It has a silly name, and healthcare is important. Okay? Sure, what should I do? Because it says we don't engage with everything. What should I do? What should I expect my teams to do if I'm judging? Should I answer it? Here's where it starts to get into content. You cannot, in BP, completely ignore a team, even if it's irrelevant. You may ignore an irrelevant argument, but if a team is irrelevant in entire and your decision is to just not play with it, it is preferable that you explain to the judges why you decided to do this. It's preferable because that allows the judges afterwards, and me as a judge, not to do that on their own. What you as a debater is trying to do is make the judge think as less as possible. We're going to get more into that. But one thing that is pretty clear is that if I'm not engaging with anything said, I want to explain exactly why their main argument was not relevant in this debate. And since it's not relevant, it can really much be explained in these two sentences we heard here. Let's talk about some people don't like it. I think that's an interesting one. Some people don't like it. Is that a strong argument?
Depends on how they word it.
Depends on how they word it. What sort of things would give some people don't like it the gravitas you would need in order to make it into an important point? First of all, who are these people? Second, how much do they not like it? Okay? What are they likely to do if they don't like it? If, for some reason, someone could build up Obamacare to be a cause for a second civil war, God forbid, that gives it gravitas, definitely. But I mean, a bit ridiculous probably in the long run in terms of like what we would think of something that costs such a thing. But definitely if someone could come and say, listen, Obamacare is something that is so divisive that its split on American society and the split that it would create is just not worth any sort of benefits, suddenly we have a bigger argument. Even though before it was like, of course some people don't like it, that's why, you know, the government existed in the first place in this motion. At least they don't like it, we know that, so some people don't like it. What am I trying to show you? What changed between the first argument, which was basically saying some people don't like it, we all know that, into turning it into an argument worthy of engagement? What changed? The structure, yes, which is part of what? Of the three things we talked about? Content. And this is where content slides into engagement. Because the fact that we have a title that's important really doesn't change much if the content isn't there to support it. And the fact that the title isn't important can be changed by content. Okay? So what is content? What is that second thing? Content is basically, and this is a very sort of like vague definition probably, but the level of sophistication that your argument has. Okay? The depth, if you want, of your argument. Okay? It feeds into the engagement because the deeper your argument is, the more close it is. Because if we talk about what is basically an argument is taking you from an agreed premise to a controversial conclusion, right? So the closer you are to that agreed premise, the harder it is to answer, and therefore engagement feeds into that. Your ability to defend yourself from engagement comes through content, and therefore your ability to attack, if you want. I love to use strategic terms when it comes to these things. To attack an argument would also come from content. So when we as judges look at things, it's not enough to say, not entirely, oh, they said those people don't matter. Therefore they've engaged, obviously, because they answered the claim that some people don't like it. They will have to explain why those people don't matter. Who are these people that we've decided that their opinion doesn't matter in this case? Okay? This is where your content goes in. If we want to consider two following arguments, okay? People have a right to choose. All can agree, probably very important in most debates, right? Versus, we believe that people have the right to choose because it's a direct and natural right they have, because of the direct and natural right they have over their own body. This is a direct continuation of it. Without the right to vote, your control over yourself becomes meaningless, and so your humanity is harmed. Okay? Notice what happened here. It's the same argument, but the content changed. The ability to come and say, this has some substantiation into it changed. And that is something that we're looking for. So a lot of times we would be able to say in the BP panel, yes, they did address that, but they did not address it with the sufficient content and the sufficient sophistication to actually overcome that just by saying one sentence. Okay? And this is when they obviously say the same thing. So, to a certain extent, what other sort of things do you think could affect what we would call a more robust, if you want, argument, or an argument with more content in a way that could change a debate? Again, they're never alone, but if we tried to, what sort of things? In an argument, one thing that the last argument I read did not have. Starts with an E, I think. Someone said it, I think? Examples or evidence in some formats, but we use examples when we talk about BP. Yes, that doesn't really matter, but yes. Why are examples so important? Why would that matter so much? Why would we say that added very much to this? What is the role the example has?
They help us support the point that you're trying to make.
Absolutely, but what is it that they do? I want to move on from they support it. I want to say, what is exactly that they do? What is the function that they fill?
Precedents. Precedents, they said precedents, they show
Well, yes, sometimes, but that necessarily, like the precedence is a bit problematic because BP does not really play on precedence because we're strong believers in is does not imply ought in general. Also, one thing you should notice about BP, precedents are not necessarily in themselves a good thing. Okay, this has to do a lot with how we judge oppositions, especially.
credibility.
It does add very much to your credibility, that is true. If we look at Aristotle, who talks about what is the tools of persuasion, one of them is ethos. apothesis logos. So if you look at ethos specifically, where that is basically your ability to by your own authority, to persuade. Yes, when you're able to bring examples, you are building on that very important persuasive tool. Okay? In a similar way that military ranks are a way of ethos. I have the rank, and therefore I said so, and that's probably true. Yes? It creates a visual, yes, that's true. It helps in terms of memorizing yourself. It helps the judges memorize, but we don't necessarily, that goes to style. We'll talk about that in a second.
That's the first of your things, but it's that whole
Yes, I'll go from that. It is sort of like, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say examples show how the logic and argumentation isn't just true in your head, but also true in the real world.
Yes, very much. That's very much, those two things are very much, it gives you concretization. This is not just a thought experiment from the moment that you can give concrete examples for what you're trying to say. It's very, very important when you use examples to try to explain why these examples are relevant and true and general. But it is clearly that this is one of those things where if we would look at two arguments and say, how do we judge them? If one person was very, very interesting, but sort of like what we call in Hebrew, we say la la land, okay? But I guess that internationally is understood what we're trying to say there. And one person had concrete examples, that person would normally be more persuasive. This doesn't mean that you're more persuasive if you just spew out examples. It all depends on how you use them. It all depends on how relevant they are. But that is definitely one sort of system. Another thing that we already talked about in terms of when we talk about content and what can make something its content more is how deep was your analysis in terms of how close were you to how would I put it? How much assertive were you? All arguments start from some assertion. Okay? That's factually true. There's nothing you can do about it. You have to start with an assertion. Was your assertion one that is something that is can be easily disproven? The original thing, the premises on which you built that argument. Okay? And if the answer is that in one sentence I could make your whole tower crumble, that's probably not a very strong argument, even if it had the examples and the sophistication that we were looking for. Okay? By the way, for those who are thinking about second half, if you look back at the Obamacare kind of thing, second half, a great way to win from second half was, let's say, a lot of people don't like it. And I took that and added content in a way that made it important and in a way that made it relevant to the debate. That is how a second half may very well win. Because they're the ones who added that quality. So an interesting step, by the way, when you want to assess the level of analysis, which is very hard to do. It's very hard to come and say that analysis was very good, that isn't, especially when we're talking about very good groups. One interesting tip that I like to use sometimes is I ask myself, how many steps do I need to make in my head in order to make that argument true? Okay? Do I need, and how many steps do I need in order to make that argument important? Did they explain to me why this is important, or was it something I understood in my head? And if the answer is it's something I understood in my head, very often that would be a sort of like a red light, not the best way to go. So, style. Let's talk about that. Where does style come in? What do we do with style? So, it's interesting because we do have some methods where you have a separate score for style. I mean, that exists in the world. But how do we treat it in BP? Someone already brought a bit about style here earlier. Memory. Help to memorize. Okay, but how do I judge that? Do I say, oh, very memorable? I took him because he was him or her, I chose that team because I thought it was very memorable? Bit problematic, right? Why is that? So how do we evaluate style? There are obviously debaters who are more stylistic than others, right? That is like a fact of life. But how do we evaluate that? Especially when style is so subjective. Come on, guys.
Creativity in their argumentation, their presentation.
That may be very true, but how do I value that when I come and say, in the end of the day, when the debate is over, I am going to have a discussion where we're trying to get a consensus and I'm trying to be helpful, right? To my chair, to my panel. I can't really tell them, well, I think they won, they were very creative. I think, I'm also actually it probably isn't a good idea to come and say, listen, I'm not sure they won, but between these two teams, I give them more style for creativity. Creativity in itself doesn't mean persuasiveness. Creativity can actually be very unpersuasive. I mean, sometimes there's a reason why you're the first person who came up with that argument. Okay? It just works like that. But then again, creativity does help us be persuaded sometimes. So how do we do this? The answer is we already did. Okay? Has anyone seen Fight Club? Quite a few. So you remember what Tyler Durden did at nights where he liked to add dirty pictures to family videos, to family movies, like one frame? And he said there, they don't know they've seen it, but they've seen it. And that's where style comes in a kind of a way. Okay? The fact that you understood the argument, the fact that that argument left an impression on you, meant that the style was good and effective. You don't need to give extra points for that, because obviously if the style wasn't good, you wouldn't have gotten it. And this is what we call today probably the best way to accept style into this whole mess. Because obviously if someone was able to deliver to me the importance of their message, deliver to me the idea that the content was something that I need to hear, make it easier for me to understand them, no matter what sort of style they chose and what my personal preference is, in a very laboratory kind of way, that means that person had good style. Style is a tool in which a message is delivered. If I did not receive the message, if I couldn't understand them, if I wasn't sure what I'm doing, that is where I can start saying, probably stylistically not the best. But again, that already happened when I decided that I couldn't understand why that idea was important, or couldn't understand why that content was helpful. So, styles was there. So, those are the three things we're looking for. And this probably helps you understand, again, why we frown upon things like model matching. Not because they're not important. Sometimes it's good to mention that the model is flawed, but we don't think people should focus too much on that because it can be answered in seconds. It does give something because it makes them look a bit bad, which is part of how pathos works, style works, but it doesn't change. It doesn't really change the game. So let's talk about methods. Okay? Now, in America, I know you often use the term flow for writing down debates. I'm not sure I ever really got what that means, but I've seen it. If that works for you, fine. I'm not going to try in this part to tell you how to write down your notes. I'm going to give you some examples of how other people do it, and you find what works for you. Okay? The ultimate goal eventually is for you to have notes that can help you during the discussion bring out a coherent and clearly explained reason for your decision. So there actually, I'll give you an example. So in my country there is, because we're a very large Jewish population, people during the Shabbat, there are people who are very observant during the Shabbat. And during the Shabbat you're not supposed to write down. However, we do have tournaments during the Shabbat. So there was a guy who developed his own system. He was a religious guy who came to the tournaments walking, everything was fine, to use a 51-card deck. Okay, I don't know how it works, I can't really explain it, but he would literally sit there during the tournament with this, he had the table in front of him, and start dealing the cards in some way that had some relation to what was said. Sounds completely ridiculous, but I judge with him, he knew what he was talking about, I don't care how he got there. And this is the attitude towards when it comes to working with writing notes. So I'm just going to give you some ideas. I really wish I could explain to you the card system, but it's just beyond me. So, normally in BP you would often see people write things in the form of a cross. One cross for first half, second cross for another half. It would look like this on the page. Do you mind if I'm not going to write anything, but it would basically be a cross that goes like this. Okay, you've probably seen it before. That is normally how people do things in VP. Again, flow can work. There are very good debaters who use the flow. It's perfectly fine. And you try to write down what is said. Now, here is where it becomes a very personal thing. There are debaters who try to write down everything. Okay? Almost minute-taking. And there are debaters who write less. I'm not going to tell you which one to use because, again, in the end, it's the results that matter. But what are the pros and cons about writing down everything? I want you to understand why you make decisions. Anyone, if I'm writing down everything, let's say I'm capable of doing that. Yes, sir?
You're probably not watching the speaker to see what they do.
That is true. That is very true. That having it is not as bad in BP as it is in other systems because we don't give points for style, so we don't have the issue of saying, did they use hand gestures? But you're absolutely right that that eye contact could, in a way, affect certain things. Like, you're absolutely right. That's true. What else? If I'm writing down everything. You can start missing things. Like, you can start finding yourself trying to miss. Good. What are the pros, then? Why would people still do that?
Why would they?
Yeah, why would they write down? Why are there those who just, like, with tiny handwriting, just go through everything?
Just use your access to POI if it wants to let you read it, that's not long.
Yeah, that is true. It's more able to document later on. Okay? And I have to say that as a chair, it's useful to have at least one person in that panel that does that. Because often is the case where, well, what exactly did they say? And you have this guy who are like, the government's role is to cough, you know, that sort of thing. Is actually sometimes helpful, but it does come at a price. It also is tremendously helpful in your role later on as feedback giver. Okay? When you can go with the debater about everything they've done, you have more ability to say exactly which sentence they could have used to make that argument just a bit sharper, just a bit stronger. Where was it that they lost the game? Okay? Obviously, I'm sure you all are familiar with this from the different fields we're in, this does lead to an information overload. Okay? If you're not trying to think about a methodical way of the debate, that kind of leads to a situation where you might have everything written down, but go find yourself afterwards. Go find where this debate starts and where this debate ends. Few things you should never do, even if you decide not to write down everything. Never, ever, 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 and I've seen debaters do this, or judges do this, never because you think an argument is irrelevant, not write it down. Okay? This is a very common mistake where people, that's very bad because it means two things that you're doing wrong. A, it means you're giving rebuttal while you're judging. You're refuting as you're judging it. That is a terrible, terrible sin. We as judges try to be as blank as possible. Okay? I like to generally look at debate where I decide I'm the king of whatever country we're in. Okay? Yes, thinking much of myself, but indulge me. Okay? And I am basically, these are my 4 trusted advisors, or not so trusted, depending on which room I'm in. And my job is to decide which team gave me the best advice on what to do now in this specific situation. I try sometimes to forget that it is a debate, forget that this is about, like, I just say, okay, let's say this house would attack Iran. I now need to decide to attack Iran. Why do I say king and not president? 2 reasons. A, no one elected me, so I'm not necessarily the best guy for the job. Okay, so I need to remember all the time that the fact that I can refute them is not something I'm supposed to be doing. And B, I come from normally families with a lot of incest, which even, more increases the chance that I can't really do the job. So that sort of thing helps sometimes. So all that, do not ever refute what you're doing. The second reason why you may be absolutely right, that at the point in which something is said, it is irrelevant. But because the rebuttal can turn it into something relevant, let's look at the arguments we had regarding Obamacare. Let's say someone said the silly thing of Obamacare, which we all agreed is silly, Obamacare has a silly name. If we started not writing things because they're relevant, it would basically say like, yeah, whatever, I'm moving on, right? What happens if for some reason the opposition, not a very strong opposition, absolutely thinks this is the greatest problem they have? That in order to defend Obamacare, they must prove that the name is the best one ever given. Suddenly, whether I like it or not, whether I'd enjoyed this debate or not, That is a relevant argument in that debate. So never disregard while you're writing. Okay? By the way, in terms of how to use, okay, so we have lots of information, we're writing a lot, there are different methods that people use, and I do advise you to try different. Some really like color coding, okay? They color code basically when they think that is the heart of the argument. Okay, just for that thing to pop up. Sometimes they just use a magic, not a magic marker, a highlighter. Okay, for that. I prefer a separate system where I have actually 3 crosses. One for writing down something that looks more like minutes, okay, more talking, and another one where it's a side thing where I basically in the end of each speech write down, what did I get from this person? What did this person give me? And I try as much as possible to reduce their argument to 1 sentence each. Okay, everything fine. What did I do there? That helps me very much do something that is similar in a way to a flow, or similar, which is later on to say, first of all, when we talk about engagement, what happened here? After I've done the engagement part, I'm able to like say, okay, let's say here they're equal, let's start looking at analysis. Let's start looking to a greater depth of what they were doing and how things were working. So that really works for me. Other things work for other people. I do recommend, okay, often also write down what you feel at the time. Don't refute it. But if you feel this argument is important, write it down, probably in a separate pen or something. It is okay to write down your own thoughts on this. But it's important to separate, is this something that you said, or is this something that came into the debate? I found different color pens to work. The last thing I recommend is switch methods every now and then. Let's assume that you found the method that works for you. You found that method that enables you to be what we call the good judge, who is able to explain themselves, follow what happened in the debate. Don't stay there. Switch every now and then. Several reasons. 1, judging can over time become sometimes boring. Okay? That switch in how you do it will help you stay more awake, especially after many rounds. Second, you're always supposed to be trying to turn into this more perfect judge if you want. And therefore, that sort of concept of let's every time try to stir things up a bit, see if I found something better, see if I found something that works for me, even if it's different from what I normally do, is something that you want to do. Okay. Now a bit more in terms of what sort of okay. How to be helpful. Okay? How do I, as a judge, become and be helpful? Okay, so what is the first thing we talked about? Your initial call, right? And you know how it is. You're going to be in a room, and then if you're a younger judge, they're probably going to start with you, and they're basically going to say, okay, how did you read it? And you're supposed to say 1 to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That is unnecessarily nerve-wracking, because you don't want to seem stupid. You're kind of tested here, right? It's a fallacy to think that that's what you're doing through, but everyone goes through it. Like, I remember myself terrified. A few things you need to remember. It doesn't matter what your call is. It matters your ability to explain it and contribute later. Okay? Having an accurate call at the beginning, brilliant, very good, but it matters much less compared to how helpful you were for the chair. Furthermore, and people tend to forget this sometimes, they ask you to give a call, 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't have to do that. It's perfectly fine to say, I think this is a top half debate, okay, which is BP lingo of saying, I think that the top half was better than the second half, but I'm not sure between 3 or 4. I'm not sure between first and second. I would like to have a discussion about that in order to clarify. That is a very, very helpful tool, because what you're doing, and this is much better than a lot of judges where you're like, you know, okay, what's your name? I'm sorry, I forgot. Demi? Okay, so Demi, would you like to give me your call? And they, you know, and everyone's waiting. Like, no, I prefer to be later. And they're basically wasting time. And all he could have said is like, you know, I think it's between these 2 teams. I'd like to talk about it some more. And that helps a lot, because what you're doing is propelling the discussion. What you're doing is actually helping us move forward, and that's your entire job. If you're doing that, you're helping. So don't worry about that. Really don't worry about that. It's a completely legitimate call. Not sure would like to discuss. Try to think with yourself before you say that. Why are you not sure? If you want to be even more helpful, say, listen, I think it's between these two teams. I would like to discuss how we evaluate their arguments regarding rights between one another. You are giving the chair the tools you need in order to reach a quicker consensus. And the chair will love you for it. And the reason he'll love you for it, or she will love you for it, is because in tournaments like Worlds, we have 15 minutes to reach that decision of 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to talk more about what that means. So anyone who's helping them waste less time is very, very helpful. Okay? Now, what happens if you gave a colleague, and obviously you're the only person in the room who thinks so? What does that mean? Were you wrong? Come on, guys. I can hear you breathing, so I know you're there. Were you wrong? Yeah.
Just to interpret the minutes differently, and so we bring that up like discussion and also like you around a little bit how they do it as well.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? There was a bit of an echo.
The issues you saw, like those work in the debate a little bit different. And so what I said you bring up might be considered a little bit less, maybe a little bit more in the discussion afterwards. And so it's important to like say how you view it.
Or totally different.
Yeah.
Or completely, totally different. This does probably mean that you're not in sync completely with what's going on in terms of how people judge debates. That's true. But there's a way to look at it. If the team you loved, the team you thought was surely first, came fourth by others, it almost by definition means they could not have been as persuasive as you think. In terms of persuasiveness, it needs to be, we're trying to test persuasive on a large group of people. It doesn't really matter if it's on one person. So take that into account. It doesn't mean you're objectively wrong if such a thing exists. But be prepared to explain what is important is not, okay, you know, there are always those wings that the moment you say, like, I think this way, flip their opinion. Those are not good wings. Yes, they do help me save time, that's true, and I did say that I like that. What is important for you to say, to be able to say, is what would you need to see or hear in order for your opinion to change? Okay? And if you're able to say that, again, we're moving forward the discussion in a very smart and clever way. Okay? Of course, obviously, don't be technical. Unless what? Don't be technical. Don't go on, they didn't do the model too well. That was new material. Don't mention it unless what? Very good. Unless it's a determining factor. Let's look at something very, very interesting, like the idea that you've all heard probably by now, that you cannot add information to the whip speech. Okay? If someone added information to the whip speech, but that doesn't change anything, don't bring it up in the discussion. Okay? And the reason you don't want to bring it up is because all these rules, like don't stab your team, don't add information, etc., are there to increase fairness. And the way to rebalance the fairness is simply not count on it. Okay? When would it be important? If you're in a panel where suddenly they're like talking very seriously about how much they loved this X material, and you're the only one who noticed, wait a second, this came up in the whip speech, that's where you bring it up. Because that means that we're doing something that is unfair. But otherwise than that, don't go into this whole, why did you not like this team? Well, they had some new material in there. And you know what? That argument kind of stabbed their other irrelevant argument. Doesn't matter. Try to stay constantly on the things that can change the way we do the debate. Okay? What can make decisions? Of course, trying to reach a consensus. Now, a lot of people, for some reason, misdefine consensus as meaning that everyone agrees. It doesn't. It means a decision that was reached by everyone, not necessarily that everyone agreed with it. Okay? And consensus is not the most important thing in the world. If you're a chair and you see that time is running out, do not make your A-teams, do not make the A-teams late as a result of it. Okay? Do not postpone the tournament or cause delays. It's okay to have a split decision. You know what? Split decisions actually sometimes are more accurate than unanimous ones, in the sense that they reflect more what the judges felt about the debate. Okay, this is especially true at finals. In finals sometimes, like in Europe, we're crazy about these things, but sometimes they have 4.5-hour discussions over a final because they want that consensus. But if you really think of it, if a team is now European champion, but not by a consensus, but by a 3-4 split, that reflects more their achievement. It's still their achievement. They are European champions, but they did it on a 3-4 split. And that's fine. Okay? Don't necessarily focus on that. It's important to hear everyone. It's important to know why you have a split. But not necessarily important to fight it with all available means. It's not another debate. You're not supposed to win. Okay. If you're in a discussion with someone, especially in longer panels, say in outrounds and stuff like that, and they start giving you a list of things that they found problematic, write them down. Write them down, you'll be able to give more accurate answers. It's very hard when I come and say, well, I thought this was problematic, this was problematic, this was problematic. It means that I'm less likely to get a good answer. But if you're encountered with this, you try to write down things and should be able to answer one by one. Finally, very important abroad, do not use terms from your own circuit. Now this is hard because how do you know which term is from your own circuit? Okay? So this requires some practice, but for example, I was once judging in China with an American debater, very talented person by the way, never mind, and we were having a discussion that went on for 10 minutes of him saying, I didn't feel they had impact. What do you mean? I didn't feel they had impact. What do you mean? Literally went on like that. Try to notice when someone isn't understanding you for something that seems pretty simple. It probably means that they are not from a circuit that uses specific terms. In this case, impact. In other cases, it would be engagement, things like top diagonals, stuff like that. Try to avoid those. What eventually are we trying to do? So that's in terms of methods. Always, by the way, always, especially in your large tournament, go to your judges afterwards and ask for feedback about your judging. What could you have done better? How could you have been more helpful to them? Now, when we look at these things, so we already said how I can assess content, how I can assess, engagement in terms of the more the important thing answered. What is it that a government is trying to do? What is the eventually gain? Eventually. What is the government trying to do? Always, ever. But almost always, depends on the motion, but in general, in most motions. Pardon? Raise an issue and do what? Resolution. Yeah. What does a resolution do? A resolution or a plan or method? Yeah. Change status quo. Change status quo. Now, one thing that Boston, that's really important to get that. They need to change the status quo in which manner? In a manner that passes the motion. Okay? There are a lot of things that people fall for that oppositions often do in judging. The fact, okay, that they want to change something does not mean that you can't change other things. I'll give you a perfect example. I think we'll work with an example. I say we should ban alcohol. Opposition comes and says we should also ban tobacco. Are they engaging with them in any significant way? No. Why is that? It's not, no, it is changing actually, the other way around.
It's not changing the relevance of the arguments.
Okay, more? Why the fact that I came and said, let's say I proved that you should do both. That they fall under the same criteria. Yeah? Exactly. It's not mutually exclusive. If the opposition wants to win on something like that, they have to prove why. Either tobacco is just, they have to prove two things actually. One is that you cannot pass alcohol without tobacco. And B, that tobacco is so important that it wouldn't be worth it. But either than that, don't let them fall for these kind of things. Another thing that people tend to allow governments to fall for is to say that their resolution is okay because similar things exist in the status quo. Anyone familiar with these kind of arguments? has to do with what we spoke about earlier with precedent. Come on. We should give free education to poor people because we already give free food. This is similar to what we're doing with free food. It's about the government helping. Right? Familiar with those? We should intervene in a certain country because it's similar to what we've done in other countries. Familiar with that? It is true that the opposition is in charge of defending the status quo. What is not true, okay, is that they have to agree with everything in the status quo. The status quo that they're trying to defend is one, a world where the motion does not exist. They don't now have an obligation to explain that everything ever done before is a good thing. Okay? Things like, how can you say that this is true because if you live in a world where pornography is allowed, the opposition does not need to defend pornography or anything they don't like. All the opposition needs to prove is that the world will be worse once we pass the motion, and the proposition has to prove that the world will be better once we pass the motion. I say prove, but that is wrong. Why? Why is prove not the right word to use here? This is a very important concept in BP. What is a proof? It's evidence, but when we say the word proof, what does it mean? What? It's very definitive, it's very conclusive, it's what you, I know that an American law system use beyond reasonable doubt, okay? That is not in any case the burden on either sides. We do not deal with beyond reasonable doubt in BP, and that's, some people don't forget that. We deal with likelihoods, okay? We deal with likelihoods all the time. So if opposition comes and says something, and this is why the nuclear war arguments are not very persuasive in themselves. Because even if you can prove that a nuclear war is possible, which is always true because anything is, it doesn't mean that that is a reason we make decisions. Think about it, okay? Think of every time you've entered your car. When you enter your car, what you do is you know that there's a possibility that the act of entering that car means something much more terminal to yourself than, definitely the, bag of chips that you were trying to get is worth. I think that's fair. However, we do it all the time because we deal with probabilities all the time. So they have to prove, in the end of the day, you're going to have to ask yourself, especially about policy debates, which side showed me that it is more likely that the world will be better or worse. That is basically, especially when we're talking between the opposing teams, the winning side. If that team showed me why I'm more likely to enjoy a better world, that means government won. More likely to have a lesser world, and lesser doesn't necessarily have to be in big, big strides. Okay? A little bad is bad. Can't be too little, because if it's too little, then it's basically, we're going like, yeah, let's give it a try. How do you decide between two teams on the same side? It's a bit harder. How do you make that decision? I hate afternoon lectures. After lunch, it's like suicide to just, yeah, sure, I'll do that shift. Role fulfillment, we tend to ignore it, maybe, actually. We literally try to ignore it. Because we find it as, again, role fulfillment goes back to what I said earlier. It's important to make it fair. We don't want to deal with that. We want to deal with, So what do I do between two teams that are on the same side? Good. Yes?
Which one is the most believable, the most compelling? Goes back to what we said about style, that I like.
Style and content and all these things. Which one? What? Which one's assertions were less obvious? You were about to say something as well?
Yeah, which team is like that? You feel like their arguments are at the core of the motion?
are much more at the core of the motion, therefore increasing their impact on what we were doing. Okay? Increase their ability to affect my decision-making in this. Okay? That's harder to do, but that goes exactly back to what we were speaking earlier. So we look at which team dealt better with the other side. Which team gave me more analysis and more content. That is exactly what we're looking for when we're talking about two teams on the same side. Finally, and the most complicated, it's the long diagonal. Okay? A long diagonal is what happens if I need to compare the team in first gov and the team in second up. Why is that so complicated? Why is this a nightmare?
They clash. They're like going against each other.
Yeah, they barely meet. Okay? What is the first thing I'm looking for in that case? No. When I'm looking for that engagement between two teams. Yeah. Yes. That's where the engagement between these two teams happened. This is extremely important because you will find these situations where it's very, very difficult. But because debate has a life of its own, and suddenly it turns into this breathing thing, and it doesn't mean that First Gov lost just because it moved on. Otherwise, First Gov could never win. We'll just ignore them. Okay? Which, by the way, is a nasty trick that unfortunately sometimes works. But yeah, so POIs would be one of those places. Did First Gov's POI really tackle anything that was brought from second up? Okay? Did it help to show why their material was still true and still relevant despite? Okay? When second up asked questions of First Gov, were these questions the kind that harmed First Gov in any significant way? Or did they show any supremacy of their own stuff? There's also an interesting question when it comes back to fairness. Could it be that the second op's question was such that gave enough heads up for First Gov that they should have been expected to deal with it by this point? Did they have enough clues to know that this would be an issue? Contact and how they dealt with the other people. And then we go into the more technical and role fulfillment. But we try to avoid that because it's not what we're looking for. We're looking for those who were in Tuna's meeting earlier, I think you put it brilliantly in terms of an interesting, fun discussion about the real issues. And debating that aspect and all these rules are the platform in which we do it. In BP, we don't want the platform to become the debate. Okay? And this is different from other debating methods where sometimes there's a lot of emphasis on what the platform, on the rules of the platform. Which is an interesting challenge altogether. I'm not saying anything bad about these except that they're inferior. Okay? Okay. So we've gone through those things. We've gone through basically how do we deal with these different aspects of BP. Are there at this point any questions regarding different scenarios in BP, different tournaments, how it works in the world, things like that? There must be something. This wasn't that good a lecture. Yes?
What do you do when we just started doing BP, and like every time I go to, it's like almost kind of different in what they expect, like whether role fulfillment is important, whether it's not. Like I don't, as a judge, I sometimes struggle with what is expected at different types of tournaments.
I assume most of the tournaments you go to are in this country, right?
Yeah.
That has a lot to do with it, in my opinion, at least from what I've observed from the outside. But BP is sort of like, in a very funny way, with a country with such a heritage of debating, BP specifically is kind of like building itself in the United States. So that normally creates a situation where things are not as clear. Some people interpret things differently. What I do recommend that you do is every year there's the World's, as I said at the beginning, the World's Adjudication Briefing. That, in my opinion, should probably be the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Something with tive at the end. Affirmative? No, that wasn't perfect. Definitive. Yeah, I knew it was something like that. So the more definitive explanation of what BP is. And I think that it would be better globally if we try to, even if it's not always the best briefing there can be, it's probably better for us as a global debating community to try to stick to that. Then again, in the end of the day, ask the judges, the CAs of the tournament. The prerogative of how you judge debate in any tournament is within the A team. Okay? Just for example, in the latest European Championship, which we held in Manchester, England, a month ago, they've added a completely new rule regarding POIs. The rule was that normally when you take POIs, you're allowed to sit the person down if you're tired of hearing them or you think you've heard enough. Not talking if it's a good idea, but you're allowed. They've added a rule that you're not allowed to do that until 15 seconds have passed, which is a game changer. But that's completely within their right to do. So what I suggest you do is ask the A teams for briefings, okay? Most of the time, if you start creating a culture that asks them for briefings, what they'll do in order to save work is just go to the Worlds one. And that would create like a more unified system today, where I think that still the United States is sort of like patching it up to an extent, but maybe this is growth. Would that be unfair to say?
I mean, it's okay. Like, maybe more specific to that. I think that internationally there's a move away from role fulfillment, but it's also a community that's been doing EP for so long that for the most part, I'd say they kind of understand the roles and they get the roles right. Whereas here, a lot of times, I think that you don't want to have to judge based on role fulfillment, but remember the point of role fulfillment is to make for a fair debate. So there are a lot of times where role fulfillment will become an issue, and the reason it would be an issue is because you've framed the debate or you've done something that makes the debate unfair to the teams around. So I say, if that's the case, then definitely you want to take that role fulfillment into consideration. But like Mike was saying earlier, it's a matter of, with new material, we're just going to kind of disregard the new material. That's not really something that you're going to, well, their role fulfillment was bad, so we're going to necessarily punish that team, right? So, but I think here that because, coming from other formats, maybe certain positions that were similar to other formats might take a debate in a different way.
Yes.
But since they don't have 4 teams to worry about, it would be fair to do that, say, only op. In a certain format. It would be fair where it's in here, it's an opening opposition team that might be cutting out opposing gov. So I think that maybe role fulfillment in the U.S. is also something that does show up as a voting issue more often than it would be in communities that either just do BP or been doing it long enough that they've kind of gotten over that sort of stuff for the most part.
Yeah. And by the way, how many people in this room are going to attend Chennai this year? Are you judging?
I'm a student judging.
Pardon?
A student of mine is judging.
A student of yours is judging. Okay, that's awesome. Okay, any other questions regarding BP in general, worlds, debating, anything like that? Okay, thank you very much. That's Michael. We can give you, but it's not, there are no rules. Like,